Welcome to episode 2 of Masters of Innovation, a new podcast exploring the digital world, the physical world, innovation and technology. One of the things that's always fascinated me is the innovation culture. How do you actually build a company that can innovate, can change the game? Because it's more than just the tech, it's actually the people, and that's what drives real innovation. And so to talk about culture and innovation, I thought there's no one better than my good friend Sean. So Sean, thank you so much for taking the time.
My pleasure. Looking forward to it.
Really, really excited. And you know, I'm working at Microsoft right now. You're ex-Microsoft. Yep. You've been on a big, long kind of career journey in terms of, that sounded like I was calling you old. It wasn't. I was like, you know, I just think you've been on a really fascinating journey from a corporate world to a kind of entrepreneurship, you know, solo kind of venture, which I think is really, really admirable and quite exciting. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about yourself, your own journey, and craft your culture as an organization.
Yeah, sure. And when I answer these questions, I think it often surprises people because, you know, I'm sitting here as a founder of a company that focuses on culture. And so the expectation when people ask me, well, what's your background? It's, well, you must have come from HR.
Sure.
And I've never spent a day in HR at all.
Yeah.
So my background's actually in tech. I spent 20 years in the tech industry, and all of my roles were focused on growth. So I started off in sales, and I worked my way through to the managing director of a startup scale-up company before then leaving that corporate world and kind of starting what I have now. And a big part of that background was my time at Microsoft. I was there for 10 years. 5 years of those were under Steve Ballmer's leadership, 5 years under Satya. And I'm
very
going to talk,
different cultures.
There's a lot around culture to be unpicked from that experience, which I found really interesting. And then I left Microsoft to then test myself in that kind of startup world. So I was a managing director of this company, and we grew it over 3.5 years. And I learned a lot about culture in that time. And those things are quite formative for me. And I came out of that period thinking, there's two things that I'm fascinated by. There's culture, and then there's growth. And those two things needed to be together for me. I've done lots of things in my life, in my corporate life, to see how I can make things grow. And I've done loads of things that didn't work. But the one thing that always works was focus on people. And that will enable you to grow. And so I thought I've got to bring those two things together. And so I studied, after leaving the corporate world, I studied behavioural science, I studied psychological safety, neuroscience, organizational design, change management methodologies. And I brought all that together, and then about a year ago now, I started Craft Your Culture, which is all about how do you enable growth through culture. That's the point in the company.
So as you mentioned, it's really all about people, right? People drive the culture, and it's the people at the top that set the culture that then ultimately dissipates across the entire organization. I mean, like I mentioned, I work at Microsoft. You've worked at Microsoft before. We even touched on it just then around the Steve Ballmer era into the Satya era. I mean, there's so much to unpack there around, you know, Satya's amazing turnaround of Microsoft. But it was all centered around culture, right? A different way of working, a different way of thinking about our competition, how we work with other organizations. I mean, interested to get your kind of thoughts on that.
Yeah, it was fascinating. I'm so glad that we're already at a point in time where Satya's tenureship in Microsoft and his stewardship of the company is being so analyzed publicly, because I think there's a lot for us to learn from that. But you know, I feel very lucky that I was in the company at the point that it made that transition. But I think it's worth, before we get into people and culture, I think it's always worth understanding what do we mean when we say culture?
Yeah.
Because I think it's such a widely used term that can be so misunderstood. And because it's about humans, it's messy, because as humans, we are quite messy. But there's a couple of things that I think are always consistent. And the first is that every single culture is different. Every company has a culture, and every single culture is different. Now, I do think culture is always important and will always deliver success and results. But as Amy Edmondson, who is probably somebody that will come up again and again in this conversation, bit of a heroine of mine. She's the founder of Psychological Safety. So she popularized that term in her research in the late 90s. But she talks about culture only really being important if there are two conditions. And the first condition is you need people to work together to achieve success. And the second condition is there is some level of uncertainty in the future in terms of what the company's trying to do.
Right.
Now, I don't know many companies that don't operate in one or both of those conditions. So therefore, I think culture is always important. But to get an understanding of what it is, my dad's actually really useful for me in this context, because I think this is the first time I've ever had a job where my dad's understood what I do.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah.
So he came from a public sector background,
Right.
and he was a director in a council.
Yeah.
And he loved the idea of culture, and he was fascinated by it. And he phones me all the time with his little cultural insights, and I love them. And he phoned me recently, and I think it's a really good example. He phoned me and said, I've been to the doctors, my local GP, and he said, I want to talk to you about that experience. I was like, okay, yep, this will be good. And he said he parked up in the car park. And the first thing he noticed was that the patient car park was further away from the GP surgery than the staff car park.
Right.
And he said, why is that? Typically patients are coming to a doctor's because they feel unwell. Why are they traveling the furthest to get to the door when they're the ones that are struggling? So that's
interesting.
That annoyed him. But then he got into the surgery, and there are posters all around the wall saying, we are patient first, we're patient-centric. Patients are more important than anything. And that dissonance really annoyed him. He's like, well, that's not what I'm experiencing here. And then he sat down in the waiting room. And the waiting room, if you imagine, is like a dog leg kind of waiting room. And on one of the walls is the TV that announces your next appointment. And it's followed by a little beep. And so the beep says next appointment, and the name comes up on a TV. So if you're in the part of the dog leg room where that TV is, then you're great.
Yeah. But if you're around the corner.
You're around the corner, then every time it pings, you're getting up and going to look at that
to
TV.
see if it's you.
Yeah. So he said, that's annoying.
Really bad customer experience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So and then his last point was around the receptionist, who was a lovely guy, my dad said, really friendly, nice, warm guy. But my dad just wanted to book his next appointment. And the guy said, you can't. You have to go home and phone or do it online, and I'm really sorry. And my dad was saying, well, this doesn't make any sense.
No.
And all of these are signals about a culture. And what's interesting about that is that he hasn't even seen the doctor at this point. He hasn't even had the experience that he's visited that place to experience.
Well, what's written down on the wall is not mirroring the reality, right? So maybe they have an aspirational culture that they are patient first.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's just a slogan that, doesn't actually have any meaning there.
Yeah, absolutely right. And this is the mistake a lot of companies make, is that they project a culture publicly that is not lived in reality in the company. Most people, when they go into a company, within their first 6 months, they'll make a decision whether they're going to stay there or not, and the predominant reason is the culture. And if they are experiencing something that is different to what they were sold, then they're very likely to leave.
Yeah.
And companies make this mistake all the time. But what that example shows, I think, is just how messy this culture
And the thing is, right, it's not like one specific thing that you could say, oh, well, and also it's like the car park. It sounds like a bit of an odd thing. And there probably wasn't any decision-making that was culturally thought through.
Yeah.
It was just a decision. It was like, oh, well, we get to choose where. We'll be next to that. That's better for us.
Yeah.
But if the culture is lived throughout the organization, it would have been a no-brainer. Well, the customer needs to have the shortest distance to the GP surgery. It's a very interesting kind of concept. But parking, you wouldn't naturally think, oh, that is a cultural conversation.
Yeah. But so Edgar Schein does the best job of putting a model around this messiness.
Yeah.
And he's kind of one of the thought leaders around organizational culture. So Edgar Schein talks about this iceberg is how it's often visualized.
Right.
And 3 layers of culture. So the layer above the waterline, what you can see, what's observable, is artifacts. So in my dad's example, that's the car park, the layout of the waiting room, the interaction with the receptionist, the TV screen, all that stuff.
In one place,
That's all observable stuff. So in an office world, that'd be dress code, email tone, how people talk to each other, things that you could go into an office, posters on the wall, and you could see them straight away. The second layer then, under the waterline, observable but harder, is where you get into espouse values. And this is things like company mission, company values, and behaviors that are celebrated, behaviors that are tolerated, so the norms, and then behaviors that are not tolerated. So harder to see, but if you are intentional, you can observe them. Then the bottom layer, the hardest layer, is the underlying beliefs and assumptions.
Right.
And these are the stories, these are the gnarly things that have made the company what it is. And it's those ingrained assumptions and beliefs that people have.
Based on past successes or failures, right?
All of those things, exactly that. The story
Yeah.
of how the company got to where it is today. And all of those things make up culture.
No, it's really interesting. And there's so many different factors to think about. But I think maybe sometimes people focus too much on the observable and not those levels lower. Maybe because it's more complicated, more nuanced. But I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's one of those things where as a person that's not an expert in culture, the observable ones are really obvious to everyone. But those other things, the subtleties, like you said about the way that decisions are made, or the toleration. I think that's the key, right? As an employee, if you see negative behaviours being tolerated or not being, dealt with, then it kind of, it starts leaking in to say, well, if they can do that, then I can do this.
Yeah.
And that's where it gets really dangerous.
Yeah, it is. And this is why culture is so fascinating, because it is based on human behavior and decision making, which is the thing that culture ultimately influences. When I'm explaining culture to somebody that doesn't know or is very new to the term, I use an analogy because I think analogies help to create common understanding. They're never perfect, but I think they help. And I use personality, human personality, as a way to explain it. So, you and I have very different personalities, and those things are shaped by what's made us and got us here today. So our education, our friends that we had at school, our family life, all our memories growing up, the things that we experienced
our
as
lived
kids,
experience.
lived experience, all those things growing up shape our personality. And our current environment shapes our personality as well. Even where we're sitting today will shape the decisions and the things that we decide to do and the behaviors that we exhibit. And then what you want to do in the future, that's the third thing. All of those things go into what shapes you and I. And ultimately then that determines and influences the decisions we make. We could be presented with 10 different scenarios right now and have to make 10 different decisions on those 10 scenarios. And our answers would probably be very different because of our personality that shapes our decision making. And it's exactly the same with company culture.
It's really interesting. And I think, especially being in an environment for a significant period of time that has a certain culture, I feel like you slowly assimilate to that. And I think that if you anchor yourself to somewhere that has a particularly negative culture, that is only naturally going to affect you as an individual, your own culture, your own personality, your own values. And I think it's very negative. So, I have friends that have taken jobs and that they've, to the point you mentioned before, like left very quickly because the culture wasn't a good fit. But I have others that joined, the culture wasn't really a good fit, but they decided to stay anyway. And those people have actually changed. They're not the same people that I knew 5-10 years ago, and I feel like it's actually affected them at a personal level. So it's really powerful, the kind of effects on the individual as well as the organization, right?
Yeah. And it's a really good point, because you have to try, as a company, you have to try and find a balance of creating a culture that delivers performance, that attracts the best talent, and then consistently embed it across the organization, and then be really honest with people about it. I think there are ingredients. For me, a high-performance culture has 3 ingredients. I think number 1, you have to start with where the company's going, and you've got to be absolutely unapologetic about that. If the company wants to be sold in 3 years and achieve X amount of revenue and profit and market share in order to get to that, then it has to start from that point.
So I used to work at McLaren, and in the Formula One team, there was this question: does it make the car go faster? And that is a really great question. So every single decision that is made is met with, does it make the car go faster? Because if it doesn't, it's not worth our while. Everything is about performance in that industry, in Formula One. So I found that a really fascinating and grounding thing. In the automotive side, there was a number. I don't think I can disclose it, but there was a number, and that number, everyone knew that number, and that was how many cars we were producing that year. So that's really interesting. So everyone knew that number. That was what your common goal was. And I think that McLaren was a very good organization for grounding that. And I think that's super critical. Because if your mission statement is very vague, people can't really align to it or know what the goals are.
That's a brilliant example. I love that, because it gives clarity. And ultimately that helps with decision making, because you can really quickly triage scenarios and think, is it making the car go faster? I think that's a brilliant example. But I think companies shy away from that. I do think it's almost like culture is designed in a way that is not to do with commercial stuff, And that's fine, except that as soon as performance starts to fall, that culture will be absolutely cut. Yeah. So you've got to have that as your starting point. That's your North Star.
Yeah.
But then you do need, the second ingredient then is the DNA, the history of the company, what's made it what it is today, because that is important. All of your stories, that's a big part of your personality. It's a big part of the company culture. So you have to have that as an ingredient. What's got you to where you are today has to be part of where you go tomorrow. Yeah. Then the third ingredient for me, and this is the one that's missed all the time, is the customer brand. You have to know what you want your customers to feel about your brand.
Right.
And you have to work back from that, because...
Which is traditionally what people would say, oh, that's marketing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
They wouldn't think that that's culture.
Yeah.
But the perception externally, and the thing is, I'm someone that's worked at major brands, and that has definitely been an attraction for me as an employee even, not just to the customer side. The interaction is like, well, I associate with the Microsoft brand or the McLaren brand, or these are all organizations that I've associated with, and that's even to a recruitment perspective has influenced my decision making, which is quite interesting as well, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you create and design your culture intentionally, then you can give a really good picture to somebody to say, Alex, do you want to come and work for us? This is what it's like here. One of the best interviews I ever had was for Google. Right. And Google said to me, Sean, it's chaos here. Right. Like it's absolute chaos. There's ambiguity all over the place. You've got to be okay with that. Yeah. And I thought, this is brilliant. I can actually now make a really informed decision.
I know what I'm going into.
I know what I'm going into, yeah. And when I get in there and it's chaos,
I'm not
ready
surprised by that. Yeah. I think that's it. Yeah, and it's all about expectations in that sense. Yeah. So this is a high performance culture. When we talk about innovation specifically, when we talk about culture, one of the things that I'm thinking about is, what is it that helps people to come up with that new idea, the new concept, right? A lot of people talk about failing fast and going through ideas. There's obviously curiosity. Yeah. How do you embed those sorts of ideas in an organization that says, okay, it's okay to get it wrong because we know that will lead to us getting it right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, what's the equation to build a culture that delivers an innovation, and why is it important? Like, why is culture the thing that can help you to get there? The best example for me is the one that we've lived through is Microsoft. When I started in Microsoft, it was under Steve Ballmer as the CEO. There's only been 3 CEOs of Microsoft, as you know, and Steve Ballmer was the second. And at that time, the share price was about $30 a share, and it was stagnant at that. It was that for a long time. And also, Microsoft was known for missing the innovation cycle. They missed phone, they missed SEO.
Profit and revenue was decent, right? So the numbers were good, but the perceived innovation and the missed opportunities on mobile, like those were the big headlines, right?
Absolutely, and I think the share price reflected the lack of confidence in the market of Microsoft at that time, and all of the other companies, Apple, Google, were flying and way ahead of Microsoft at that point. But I think what's really interesting now when I look back at that is when Satya came in, he didn't say, I'm going to change the culture. He didn't say, these are our new values. He didn't say, this is all of the new leadership principles we have. Yeah. He said, I'm going to challenge your mindset. And the very first thing I remember, 5 years into my time at Microsoft, day one of Satya, was we need to move from fixed mindset to growth mindset. Yeah. And the mantra I remember in the company at that time was, we are learn-it-alls. That's what we do. And when I think about what it was before Satya, it was knowledge is power. Right. If you search, if you do a Google search or a Bing search for Microsoft infighting, there's this really classic cartoon of different divisions of Microsoft holding guns to each other. Yep. And that's what it was like. That was my experience of what Microsoft was like. And I'll give you a story about how I think this manifested in the organization, this knowledge is power idea. There was this thing called mid-year review. Right.
I've heard rumors about it.
Yeah, it's legend, right? Yeah. Story is legend.
Before my time, but I hear it was a bit brutal, right?
It was brutal. So it always happened about January time. Right. And the idea was Kevin Turner, the COO, Steve Ballmer, the chief exec, would fly around the world to different subsidiaries, of which UK was one. And they would spend time in this tent. They called it tent, but it was the Sofitel Hotel in London. Right. Okay. Big, big room. And you had all these powerful execs, including those two, at one side of the table. And then on the other side of the table, you had all the divisions in that particular subsidiary, public sector, enterprise, M&O, all these different subsidiaries of Microsoft that would then be presenting their business. Right. And people would prep for months to do this because ultimately the objective, if you're on the other side of the table to the execs, is you keep the Eye of Sauron off you. That was what it was about. Deflect, exactly. So you told a story and you had your all of your numbers to hand. But what they had to do was they had to have it on the top of their mind to recall instantly. Their value and the thing that gave Eye of Sauron no reason to pause on you is if you projected confidence by being able to recall everything straight away. And so that was all the prep. Learn all the deals, learn all the customers, and be able to recall them so that nobody looks at you.
How much time is spent on that rather than actually with the customer and transforming their organization with technology?
Yeah, and well, there's two main problems with it. First one is it ripples through the organization. Yeah. So those people that are subjected to this experience go back to their management teams. Yeah. And of course, they have to be delivering the same rhythm so that they're prepared for when these mid-year reviews come up. So they forecast down like that, and then that in turn forecasts down like that. So as a manager, I'm subjected to that. Every Monday afternoon, I remember going into a room and I had to learn all of my 10 sellers and all of their 10 customers and all of their deals associated with those, so that the instant I was asked about any particular one, I would have something to recall. And my job was keep the Eye of Sauron off my business.
So it's really interesting. So I worked at another major organization, and there was a daily one-to-one happening between one CEO and another CEO internally in different areas, because there was so much scrutiny on an area of the business. The knock-on effect of that daily one-to-one CEO meeting was insane.
Yeah.
Because all of the teams underneath each CEO was having to prepare all of this stuff every day. And it was like, what is this information? We need that. This needs to be the deadline's 4 p.m. because we've got to review it before 9 a.m. tomorrow's call and stuff like that. And it was like, it just caused an internal chaos. Whereas I almost wonder, do the CEOs at that level even know the chaos that underneath that is caused by this, just a daily meeting?
Yeah, it's a brilliant example, another brilliant example. And I don't think that the execs actually know and understand the ripple effect.
I don't think they do.
Of this. Because if you think the amount of time that is lost in all stages of this, but ultimately, what is then an inaccurate story? That's problem two. Well, problem one is the ripple effect, down. Problem two is the quality of information, up. When Steve Ballmer and Kevin Turner leave the UK tent and go and look somewhere else, what have they actually learned? Yeah. Nothing that reflects reality would be my guess. And that's the second problem with
because it's bred that culture of we need to present this in a certain way because that's the format it needs to be delivered. Yeah. It's really interesting. And I guess, just on that, that transition, I guess, on the Microsoft thing, I think it's a great example of, maybe a follower culture into a leader culture and stuff like that. So interested, maybe let's circle on, just more like a holistic view. If you're a leader entering an organization and you feel that the organization's culture is not right yet, maybe it's has a follower mentality, there's not very much innovation in that company, they're kind of just, continuing with that same path. How do you transform a culture? Interested to kind of get your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I always like to look back on history and learn the lessons from what's happened before to then help us make informed decisions around, how we go forward. And so the question that I ask myself in this context is, how do you build a culture for innovation? And, particularly if you are in a position or if you're in a company where you feel like the innovation is not happening. And the first thing I always do is think about, well, what can we learn from things that have happened before? And my favorite example, the one that I've spent the most time researching is the Blockbuster Netflix story.
It's a classic story, right?
It's brilliant. And I think we all know the headlines to this story. And history is littered with other examples. It's not just Blockbuster, Kodak, Nokia, loads of other companies
the one that comes to mind.
Have had this, are in this kind of graveyard where they've missed a moment of innovation and they've been disrupted. And then we can look back on that and be very quick to judge and think, well, they failed to innovate. And that's what held them back. But actually the story is really interesting. So, for people that don't know about Blockbuster, they were a whale.
If you're younger than 25, you probably don't even know this concept of VHS, right?
Yeah, well, exactly, right, yeah. So 20 years ago, they were a $6 billion a year company.
I remember on Saturday nights going to Blockbuster and asking the video store guy, what's the recommendation? What have you got in new? Yeah. And getting like a DVD or VHS, gone are those days. It's all digital now, right? But at the time, it was massive. And on a Friday night, that place would be pretty popular.
Absolutely, it would be, wouldn't it? Yeah, exactly that. And it was such a weird concept now when you think back on the business model. I mean, you had to go and choose you drive somewhere, choose your movie.
And they might not have it.
Yeah.
I've been there a couple of times. Like, I really want to watch this movie. It's like, oh, sorry, it's all 4 of our copies are out.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly.
But then the other bonkers thing about it is you then had to return it within a certain period of time.
Or you get fined.
You get
fines.
So do you know how much of the $6 billion they made a year
was in fines? I mean, the fact that you're asking me that question makes me feel like it's quite a lot.
20%.
20%?
Over $1 billion a year
was in late fees,
which is all profit.
Yeah. And that was always like a friction experience, right? People didn't like that. It was like a library book. I mean, even do people even rent library books anymore? Maybe, But the late fee was always a concept that was like a friction. People didn't like it, right? Because it's effectively a fine.
It's exactly that. It's exactly that. But people accepted it. It was a norm. But someone that didn't accept it was Reed Hastings. Right. And that was the co-founder of Netflix. He disagreed with this idea of having to be charged for giving a movie back. Yeah. And at the time of DVDs being invented, he started Netflix.
Sure.
And his idea was get a big warehouse, fill it full of movie titles on DVD, and then post them through a subscription service to customers that would order them via a website. Right. And really different new model, disruptive. And they built that up from the mid-90s. Now, the story has it, they get to about 1999, they've got several 100,000 subscribers, and they go to Blockbuster and say, we want you to buy us.
But at this point in time, they weren't profitable, right?
No, they were losing about 50 million a year.
Wow.
In revenue, yeah. And they offered a buy price of 50 million to John Antica, who was the chief executive of Blockbuster at that time. And what everybody can look back and judge Blockbuster on is the decision to say no at that point. Netflix are now $250 billion in terms of their worth. Blockbuster are a museum experience somewhere in the US. But there's a lot more underneath that, which I think tells a really interesting story about culture and how it's crucial for innovation. Because in that stage of late 90s, early 2000s, there was a lot happening. So Blockbuster actually launched their own online subscription service without late fees. And they grew to 2 million users far quicker than Netflix did. So they were way ahead of Netflix. They also had at that point a new investor called Carl Icahn who came in. And he was brought in to turn the company around. And at that same time, the other external factor was the dot-com bubble bursting. And so the internet was suddenly quite risky as an investment decision and as a business model. And so if you think about all those factors then, and you picture yourself in that boardroom at Blockbuster, and maybe you're the person that wants to position online subscription as the model to go forward with, that's a hard battle because you're surrounded by people.
That one person, that one voice of innovation in a room full of people that are interested in the status quo because it makes a lot of money, right?
Yeah, and all of their history points to the data we know, the things we know, are the things we've done before that have given us money. And then the specialist in the room, the big investor who would therefore carry a lot of influence, is brought in to turn the company around and is saying we should be going back to what has made us great before. So the easiest decision to make, and probably at the time, the most rational decision to make,
the safest decision
was to stay as they were. And of course, we know how that story ends. But I think what it tells the story of is how hard it is to overcome status quo bias, which every individual's brain wants to do because it's away from uncertainty, and the group dynamic wants to shy away from as well, because who wants to put their hand up and say, I want to do the thing that's different to the thing that made us $6 billion a year in revenue up until now. And there was no frame of reference. Netflix are still losing tens of millions a year at this point. So there's not even a success story to say we should be like that.
Yeah, you can't point to a streaming service that's already successful and say, let's pivot, right?
Absolutely.
When you're on the forefront of it, there is no one else. You are trailblazing. And I think that's the challenge. You can't use that as a frame of reference to help sell your idea internally, which is a challenge. So I guess from a practical perspective, I mean, how do organizations avoid this this kind of trap of the status quo, and actually, what are the practical steps to innovation?
And I think what Netflix did was learn that lesson, because they pivot their business model constantly. Sure. They avoid the status quo by constantly disrupting their own business.
Right.
They went from DVD streaming to online streaming to
creating their own content.
Creating their own content, exactly. And my advice that I give to companies when they're trying to become more innovative is to think of it in 3 levels. So think of it first as an individual, because that's where the ideas have to come from to start with. If you scheduled time into your day and said, 15-minute slot, have ideas, you're probably not going to be very successful.
No.
But if you go and have a shower, you're
Or
probably
go for a walk.
more likely to have an idea. And I'm not saying spend all day having a shower, but I'm saying understand what's happening that enables the climate for ideas to happen. There's this default mode that we have in our brains that is a network of things like where creativity comes from, where retrospection comes from. Those things fire up when our brain is relaxed. And that's where ideas are generated. If you try and constrain ideas and say, right, brainstorming 1 hour, you're immediately adding constraints to something that doesn't need to have constraints. So understand the conditions, and the things that stop ideas are stress, distractions, metrics. You must come up with ideas. Those things are the enemies of ideas. So think about ways you can create climates for your people to have ideas is the first thing I would suggest. Then you move on to the team dynamic. Those ideas then have to come to a team where they can kind of percolate and be...
They're not immediately shot down.
No.
All ideas are
they're
welcome.
picked about, they're kind of chewed over.
Yeah.
And the big ingredient for that is psychological safety.
Right.
I mentioned Amy Edmondson at the start. She is the founder of Psychological Safety. She's the one that popularized it through her work. The Fearless Organization is her book on this, and the research is great. But very, very simply, psychological safety is about feeling like you can speak up in an environment where there are other people and voicing things like an idea or a challenge or not knowing or making a mistake without the fear of retaliation. And that's a really big, important thing for teams to have to get to high performance.
It's really interesting that, because, if I think back to my experience and my lived experience, so I studied physics at university, and I always was fascinated about, the planets, the universe and everything like that. And that at one point could have been a career path for me. But I had a negative experience there that ultimately has driven me in a different direction, and probably for the better. But the negative experience was when I used to be in some of the lectures, if I put my hand up and asked a question that other people in this organization or in the course thought was a stupid question, I would hear sniggerers in the back of people laughing, or people saying, oh, he doesn't know what he's on about, and stuff like that. And then it gets to a point where you don't want to ask a question, right? You then start waiting for the lecture to end to go to the lecture at the front, and it just promoted this feeling that, like, oh, maybe I'm not smart enough for this. And I agree that I probably wasn't smart enough for it. But the fact is that, like, I never felt that I was comfortable there to continue there. So I think we were talking about culture. I think the culture of that intake, for example, within my university for physics at that time, like, it bred a culture of people like showing off, I'm so smart, and not actually, do you know what, we're all here to learn. Which I think, it's quite similar to what you were saying there.
It's a brilliant example, Alex. I'm sorry you had that experience, but it's a great example. And it's interesting how poignant that was in your mind, because that is the reality. Most teams operate in the absence of psychological safety, which is why at the end of a presentation, when somebody says, any questions, nobody says anything. And a lot of people in that room probably don't understand, but nobody will speak up. And so there's complete misalignment. The presenter thinks they go away, everyone's understood what I've said. Everybody else in the room is thinking, some of us do, some of us don't. But that fear stops that person speaking up. And in your case, what's interesting about that is the impact of somebody feeling psychologically safe, the people that knew it and probably felt safe to speak up, their negative impact on others that didn't understand, that needed to speak up. Psychological safety is not just about you feeling like you can speak up, but it's about creating the conditions for the people around you to be able to speak up as well.
I think that's really important. I think, you see it in rooms all the time, and this comes back to, like, inclusion as well, right? Which is, sometimes the best ideas are ones that won't be raised unless prompted. There are people in a room that are a bit quiet, but super in-depth and that I respect their opinion. And I'll actually go out of my way, especially if you have loud talkers in the room, to try and bring them in. Because if you don't do that, there's so many ideas that, what if they think that that's not a good idea? Actually, I'm not going to say. But actually, it could be a great idea. But you need to have that, that safety, that feeling. And then sometimes there needs to be, from the louder people in the group, that active listening and bringing people into the conversation.
Yeah, it's a really tough dynamic to create, and you've got to be intentional, but it is the ingredient that will give you high performance. And it's a great melting pot, a climate for ideas to progress from something in somebody's head to being challenged, discussed, debated, and then to move on to the next level, which for me then the third level is the company level. So this is where you've got to think about creating the conditions for those first two levels, but crucially, how do ideas move into execution? And a company that does this really well for me is Amazon. They have this whole internal approach to creativity. AWS, Amazon Web Services, was born through this process. And they have lots of failures like Amazon Fire Phone and all these ones, but they can afford 20 or 30 failures when they've got an AWS that comes through that process as well. And their process wouldn't work for everybody. They have a very documented process by which you take your idea and you go through this business plan template, you answer all the questions, you submit that. I think it then goes to some kind of review. Okay. It's a really specific, quite rigid process, but it educates their people on, well, how do I need to take an idea from what I have right now to something that could be used in the marketplace or could be launched or something like that. So it educates their people, which I think is a really smart way of doing it. But you couldn't take that template and then just think that will work everywhere.
No.
If we talked about Netflix, if you applied that to Netflix, Stranger Things would never have been born because Stranger Things doesn't sit in a box. It's not a horror, it's not a teen movie, it's not a nostalgic hit, it's all of those things. Yeah. So that probably wouldn't have happened if that same process was applied. So at a company level, you've got to think about what is our way of taking ideas into execution.
It's not a one size fits all, right?
No.
There's no such thing as the ideal culture. I guess it depends on a multitude of factors, your historical elements, which you've mentioned, all the way through to where you want to be. Yeah. And those decisions are going to craft ultimately the direction and the decisions that you make.
Absolutely, yeah. But the interesting thing is when you see the influence that the culture has on the product. Yeah. So I run an activity with groups, workshops around customer brand, and I'll put up the picture of Amazon.
Right.
And the app we've got on our phone, right? We all order stuff through it. Yeah. And I'll say, write down words about how you feel about that, what it makes you feel like. And then there's the usual list of words of convenience, fast, quick, easy, simple, customer-centric, all that stuff. Then you relate those words back to their 12 leadership principles. And all of those words are on there.
Right.
And so that's a really good example for me where a company's intentional about their culture and their design and how that influences their product and then how their customers feel about that.
Yeah. I think like Bezos has said some things as well. He's like, think about the 10-year thing, right? Yeah. So for example, he says in 10 years, people will still want fast delivery and low prices.
Yeah.
I mean, it's obvious, but sometimes just vocalizing that, it just can essentially like, okay, well, that's two things that we should definitely be focused on.
Yeah.
So I think that, we talked about, previously like the McLaren example around, that sort of thing, does it make the car go faster, that sort of thing. I feel like those sorts of things that you just need them as grounding points.
You do, and interestingly, Amazon have the same. Yeah. So like Microsoft with growth mindset, like the McLaren one, Amazon one is day zero mentality.
Right.
And it's constantly reinforced on their website and through how Jeff Bezos addresses the company. And that's all about think like a startup, constantly think like a startup, which is great. And that leads me on to my last thing really that you need to think about as a company. You need to be okay with, it's a horrible phrase, but your baby being ugly.
Right.
You've got to be okay with people telling you that the thing you've created, the thing you have could be better.
Yeah.
And if you don't have that from the top down, you won't have innovation and the pivots and the changes and the disruption that we've talked about with other companies.
Constructive conversations and criticism, super powerful.
Yeah.
I think that if you're not able to accept the criticism of your baby, let's say, right, it's a real challenge because, and then people don't want to give the feedback because they don't feel, again, back to that psychological safety, right? I don't want to upset you, Sean.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to tell you that this is really rubbish.
Absolutely.
Or, this feature doesn't work. But if I'm worried about upsetting you, rather than having a culture of saying, hey, look, we're both on this mission together. I don't think this is working. Here's my evidence of that. What do we do to fix it? That is a much better approach, right, from a cultural perspective.
Absolutely, and you've got to be intentional about creating that because the default for us as humans, with ego tied into that and all that kind of different stuff, is to not respond favorably to that type of conversation. So you've got to really construct something that enables people to do that.
It's all about intention, like you were mentioning. For me and for probably many in the audience, they're probably thinking, this is great from an organizational perspective if I'm a leader and setting a culture. But if I'm an individual, how do I, better plan my career? How do I, navigate a corporate environment? I'm interested to get your thoughts on, from your own personal perspective and obviously all the coaching and mentoring that you do. Where does an individual start on that kind of journey?
Yeah. Do you know what? When I started the company, the most consistent call I got was, can you tell me how you found your passion?
Right.
And, I'd get all excited to get all these new leads, but they're not leads, they're people wanting to ask me that question, which is fine. It's an interesting, but it was so consistent. And then I thought I need to understand and explore this a little bit. So I did a bit of work on understanding this. And I think that where people get to in life is they kind of start in a career, usually to earn money and to pay off debts and because they need to get onto the wheel somewhere. But then you very quickly get almost indoctrinated into this organization that molds you into someone that needs to climb a ladder because everyone around you is climbing a ladder, and we're always influenced mostly by who we're immediately surrounded by. And then you look at, well, what are the things I need to do to climb that ladder? What do I need to shape myself into to progress higher? And so you lose part of your identity through that process. And then maybe in your 30s, you've got a bit of experience, you could go and do something else. But then often that's starting families, having kids. Financial commitments come with that, which means taking a risky move is much less likely. And then you get to your 40s and 50s, and that's the profile of the people that were calling me all over the last year. And they'd say, well, now I have the ability to make a decision, but I don't know who I am. I don't know what I'm passionate about.
That's quite sad, actually.
It is really sad, I think, But I think it's not irrecoverable. And what I've learned through the process that I've been through is you've just got to notice your curiosity. And you've just got to follow it and look at where it wanders. And so the first activity I always say to people is just think about what catches your eye. When you're on LinkedIn, when you're looking at podcasts, when you're reading articles, what are the things that catch your eye? Write it down. And just understand why that thing is interesting to you. Second thing to do is write down where you get energy from. On a typical day, you could be doing any number of things in meetings, doing one-to-ones, presenting, fixing something, working on something. Where do you get your most energy from, and where do you not get energy from? And then the third step I always say then is spend a little bit more time on the things that you're getting energy from and where your curiosity goes. And just spend a deliberate little bit more time in that area. And the more you intentionally do that, the more things open up. It helps you explore your passion and your interest and your curiosity. Is this something I could do more of? And it exposes you to people that have similar passions, interests, and curiosities. And then that can help you build a network that can ultimately lead to different things. But you've got to be intentional at that starting point to understand yourself and see where that goes.
I think you have to seek out that as well. Like, it's firstly identifying what gives you energy, 100%. But even like, if I think about myself and this podcast, one of the things that I've learned in my time at Microsoft is that I really enjoy innovation and talking about innovation. And the other thing that I enjoy is getting energy from other people, from learning. I'm getting a lot of, energy from this because I'm learning about culture and things that I don't necessarily know everything about. And so that's why I've created this podcast. Nobody asked me to. So I think there's the element of finding what drives you. But then I think as well, you have to sometimes take control yourself and say, hey, no one's going to give me this. You have to kind of sometimes do it for yourself, right? Which I'm sure, is probably what led you to craft your culture, right?
It is, but I think the mistake I made, and that I always advise people against, is I thought it was an all or nothing.
Right.
I had to follow my passion and therefore leave what I was doing and follow it immediately.
Sure.
And I think you can take a lot of baby steps before you make that move.
I think that I've certainly seen that on a lot of podcasts. People talk about this definition of like the side hustle. So often people are quitting their full-time job, starting something, investing in something, and then realizing that there's no actual market for what they were planning to do, at which point they found themselves in a difficult situation. But what you see is actually the advice that I've seen on various other kind of platforms is that actually do things on the side, enjoy that, and if it turns into something, then that can go in that direction. Is that how Craft Your Culture started, or did you go all in?
I went all in.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's your learning is that maybe initially that was the wrong decision.
Yeah. And also I think you need, when faced with anything uncertain, I think you need to apply consistent principles in your decision making. And I didn't know what they were. And so I think I know better now that I think what was important to me, what were the principles that I can apply to the decisions I make. I know those now. I didn't have those before.
It's really interesting. Super cool. I guess to close things out, I wanted to kind of look at the kind of future and, what are the trends that are really kind of catching your eye in terms of things that people need to be aware of when it comes to culture? I mean, obviously AI is super, hot right now, and there's impacts across an entire organization in terms of the ways we work and how we connect. I'm interested to get your thoughts on, not specifically just AI, but in terms of the trends for culture. Is there anything that kind of catches your eye?
Yeah, I think there are two main things that I'm conscious of thinking about that I can see being big impacting influences on culture over the next 12 months. The first one is political.
Yeah.
I think we're living in a world now where you can't escape that a company will need to have some form of political standpoint on things that are happening. We have world wars going on. We have unprecedented amounts of unrest. We've got something like 58 elections across the world in the next 12 months,
crazy.
and some big ones, UK and US just being two of those. And there's going to be an awful lot of fallout from that, and that will impact how people feel. And so you can't escape, I think, all of that happening and how that's going to impact people day to day. And so culturally, that is going to be a big influence. And the second thing is all the disruption with artificial intelligence. Anything that is new, that is significant, will cause uncertainty, and uncertainty is the thing that the human brain fears the most. So that will impact things culturally as well. At the same time, what an exciting era
100%.
to be working in, to be setting up a new business in, to be transforming what you do, to be thinking of new ways to do things. You've suddenly got all the mechanics and the opportunities to do things that maybe have never been possible in human life up until this point. So you really could do anything, but your mindset and the culture will be the things that enable those companies to be successful ultimately and how they navigate.
Yeah, so I was previously speaking to Lauren, and one of the key things we were talking about is this democratization of the technology. It's available to anyone, and that enables people to scale up, right? People are talking about this like one-person billion-dollar startup that will be here eventually, right? Supported by things like our AI. So super, super exciting. And I just wanted to say thank you so much for taking the time. If people wanted to find out more about Craft Your Culture or book a one-to-one with you, I mean, what's the best way to reach out? Obviously, you're on LinkedIn, you have a website. We can put the website link on the screen, but what's the best way of getting in touch?
Yeah, so I have the website, and you can have a look at that. I've got courses, etc. You can go through there. My LinkedIn is where I put everything. Everything I learn, I put through LinkedIn. And I've got a newsletter that's free to subscribe through there as well.
Oh, amazing. Right, perfect. So thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.